Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two topics. The first one is going to be the abduction, the kidnapping of two Armenian soldiers over the weekend by the Aliyev regime. And the second one is going to be covering the ongoing talks between the two sides, the Prime Minister's announcements regarding Artsakh, and the upcoming meeting in Moldova between the Prime Minister of Armenia, the dictator from Baku, President Macron, Scholz of Germany, and Michel of the European Union. Let's start with the first big story of the week, which is the kidnapping of the two Armenian soldiers by the Aliyev regime. This happened on late Friday night. These were two soldiers who were supplying one of the forward bases on the Armenian side of the border. What happened is that forces from the other side, Aliyev's army, crossed the border and stopped their vehicle and kidnapped them and took them back to their side of the border. The road itself, and actually the location that they were kidnapped, is no more than 300 to 400 meters away from Azeri position. So this was actually rather easy to do if you're so criminally inclined as the regime in Baku is. Both of these individuals that were abducted on Friday night were charged immediately on Saturday by a court in Azerbaijan, which is rather interesting because most places courts aren't open on Saturday, but apparently this was all a setup. So they could be charged. What they were charged with was exactly the same thing that the two Azeri soldiers that crossed the border last month and were abducted, except one of them actually committed a murder in Armenia. They were essentially taken, charged with the same counts of crossing the border, having guns and this and that. The immediate response to this is that the Armenian government has appealed to the European Court of Human Rights over this abduction of these Armenian soldiers from Armenian territory. So we're trying to figure out what is the most likely reason for this kidnapping. I think it's very clear that they want hostages to exchange for the two Azeri soldiers that crossed the border, and specifically to get the murderer freed, who's likely to get a long sentence. So this is essentially an attempt at blackmail. The second one is to obviously take another step to scuttle the peace process and not to sign any kind of a peace agreement with Armenia. And this is just another little provocation. What can we say about this? I mean, at the end of the day, what do you say about a state that is actually willing to cross international borders and kidnap random people? Or random soldiers in this case. That is really not a state, but frankly, a terrorist organization. And frankly, this is not the first kidnapping that they have done. A few years ago, they kidnapped Israeli blogger Alexander Lapshin on a presidential plane, took him to Baku, tortured him before they were forced to release him. And they also did this with their own citizens when they kidnapped an Azeri journalist from Tbilisi, framed him, and took him back and put him in jail for many, many years. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, and we're going to start with the Moscow summit meeting between President Putin, Prime Minister Pashinyan, and the dictator from Baku. There was a very short 20-minute meeting that happened between these three leaders, and the only announcement that came out of it was something about reopening of the railway systems between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and through to Russia. Not much more than that, and an announcement that there's going to be a follow-up meeting between deputy ministers to actually get this going. We've had this kind of announcements countless times from these three-party meetings, and frankly, nothing has come of it. The second part of this exchange, which is actually quite interesting, was a war of words that broke out between the Prime Minister Pashinyan and the dictator from Baku during the Eurasian Economic Union Summit. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's sort of the local kindergarten version of the EU. This essentially turned into a debate between the two sides in regards to specific statements that Aliyev had made, which were quite provocative. One of them was about the corridor, where he was talking about the Zangezur corridor and about how Russia supports his position. It's something that, by the way, Putin never denied. And the Prime Minister was very quick to respond to tell him that in the November 9th agreement, there was no talk of such a corridor, and the only corridor that was being discussed was the Lachin corridor, which is the one that's currently being blocked by the regime in Baku. In response to this, Ilham denied that there's any kind of a blockade, which is obviously a total lie. But more importantly, he justified the position of putting in border posts by the fact that the week before Pashinyan had officially recognized the territory of Artsakh as part of sovereign Azeri territory. Frankly, what was most revealing in all of these exchanges is if anyone has any doubt about the level and the strength of the Aliyev-Putin alliance, you just have to watch the video and the body language from it. Ilham was exceptionally comfortable with his dictatorial peers, whenever he's meeting with Western leaders, he always looks like a little schoolboy. And here he was, hugging Lukashenko, and he was quite comfortable in this setting. At some point, him and Putin were essentially blinking at each other and smirking. It's very clear that when it comes to this club of dictators, they're as thick as thieves. On a corollary note, there's a video that we found which was quite interesting, and for those people who think that giving away the right of sovereignty for the people of Artsakh is going to help bring peace or end all of these issues, I would ask you to listen to what the Turkish foreign minister had to say on the campaign trail last week.
Türk'ün yolu Türk Devletleri Teşkilatı'ndan geçer. İşte Türk Devletleri Teşkilatı'nı kurduk, tüm Türk dünyasını birleştirdik. Türk'ün yolu kardeşlerimizle onlarca yıllık emekle kurulan orta koridordan geçer. Türk'ün yolu kadim Türk yurdu, Türk yurdu toprağı şehit kanıyla sulanmış Şuşa'dan geçer, Cebrail'den geçer, Zengezur'dan geçer. Ermenistan Başbakanı Paşinyan bile Karabağ dahil Azerbaycan'ın toprak bütünlüğünü tanımaya hazırız diyor. Senin derdin ne? Niye bypass ediyorsun Azerbaycan'ı?
This is obviously no random thug from the Turkish political system, but actually the working foreign minister of the country that is actually making claims on sovereign Armenian territory and actually openly admitting his country's central role in the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. To this, as far as I know, there's never been a response from our foreign ministry. I assume they're still living in the imaginary normalization process that's actually going to bring relations and open the border. Immediately following the Moscow summit, what we noticed is that Ilham Aliyevs' rhetoric became far more aggressive. This was likely designed to kill the possibility of the signing of any agreement in Moldova or following up to that, which he does not want. Obviously, the second part is this is hand in hand working with the Russians, which are obviously interested in the same thing. He's essentially following their instructions. At the end of the day, no servant is greater than his master. What came out was this is the statement that Ilham made to local media, and I'm just going to read all of it. Everyone knows that today we have all the possibilities to carry out any military operation in Karabakh. Therefore, the parliament of Karabakh should be dissolved. All ministers should resign, and the one who calls himself president should surrender. Only in this case can we talk about the application of amnesty against the authorities of Karabakh. There can be no question of any independence and autonomy. During the Second Karabakh War, we closed the topic. So essentially what he is threatening is ethnic cleansing. And we can assume that this is some variation of the rights and securities that the EU and the US have been promising us in regards to the Armenians in Artsakh. So what was the Western reaction to all this? The US State Department, in their great wisdom, actually praised him for his offer of amnesty. Amnesty for what? They did not specify, or what crimes that people in Artsakh have committed outside of living on their own land in freedom and not being controlled by a gangster regime in Baku. The EU president, on his part, asked both sides not to come in with maximalist demands. I just have a question for Mr. Michel. If our demands are that there'll be no ethnic cleansing or genocide, can you explain to me what the minimalist demands would be? All of this is obviously disgraceful. So let's try to figure out or understand what is the likely outcome of the meetings in Moldova this Thursday. There's essentially a few options. The first one is that Ilham comes up with some excuse, working with his Russian friends to blow up finalizing any kind of an agreement. And he essentially takes the recognition of Artsakh as Azeri territory, puts it in his pocket, and walks away. It's going to be very hard for him to justify not signing anything, given that the fact that he has gotten everything that he's always wanted. And this is a historic chance to essentially put all of this on paper. So it is not out of the question that he ends up signing something eventually. However, after signing it, he will obviously try to use coercive methods not to implement it, because frankly, if you look at the outline of what's being discussed, at this point, almost all the gives are going to be his. He's the one who has to withdraw from Armenian territory. He's the one who has to grant rights and securities or most likely allow Western presence in Artsakh. He's the one who has to free the POWs. So he has 1,000 ways to actually blow this thing up. And if you're cooperating with the Russians who are there, there's countless ways to come up with conflicts that can actually not allow the implementation of whatever is agreed to. And frankly, given the fact that almost every aggression that he has taken since September 27th of 2020 has never been punished, him doing so would actually be quite irrational on his part. In conclusion, what would be the consequences of Ilham actually either walking away from this Western peace deal or actually signing it and not implementing it? In one word, the consequences would be likely nothing. In reality, what we're looking at is the real possibility of an agreement in such circumstances with an enemy like this is quite unlikely and quite unrealistic. In short, we should expect nothing and prepare for the worst outcomes.
Лейла Ильхам вице-президент фонда Гейдара Алиева, глава представительства фонда Гейдара Алиева в Российской Федерации, Азербайджанская Республика.
Expressing her gratitude for such a high assessment for her activities, Leyla Aliyeva congratulated the Russian president. She said she was honored to receive Pushkin Award. Saying that a sculpture to the genius poet Pushkin was erected in Baku, she stated that Russia-Azerbaijan relations had ancient roots.